Well, welcome to the Shepherd Heart of Leader podcast, where we explore topics that help strengthen your ability to care for those under your leadership. Now, today, we know that churches are filled with people who have suffered trauma and abuse and neglect, and they need a safe place to encounter Jesus. And so our guest, Diane Stores, has been actively working to bring healing to those who have suffered from trauma and abuse. Now, Diane is the founder and executive director of Door of Hope. It was born out of her passion for ministering to those affected by abuse and neglect. Diane survived a 23-year marriage that was filled with every form of abuse. So she has firsthand experience on this topic. She has worked in a pastoral setting, chaplaincy, and recovery settings. Additionally, she was the founder and executive director of the Dwelling Place, the United States first Christian.
Yes, safe house for women and children. Yes.
So, Diane, welcome to the podcast. And so there's so much happening in our world. There's so much trauma and abuse, and maybe we'll just start there. What have you seen, and what is the need?
Well, Jodi, I think every one of us need these services. The prayer ministry, the support groups. Nobody gets through life without some wounds. And the statistics really bear that out. And right now, 1 in 3 women have been sexually abused as little kids, and 1 in 5 men. Oh, wow. And also, a statistic you may not be aware of is 1 in 7 men have been abused by their female partners. So there's not a lot of places for these guys to go. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And so now you started Door of Hope. Maybe talk about what is Door of Hope, and there's several different facets, but talk about that.
Well, I didn't really plan on starting another nonprofit. I was pastoring at a church, and my roles were I was the mission pastor, and I started a lot of small groups and support groups, but I was also over missions and outreach. And no matter where I went in our own community or in other countries, I became more and more aware of the lack of resources. And you get into some of these other countries, and there's no resources for those who have gone through abuse. So during those latter years of pastoring, God kept leading me back to Hosea 2:15. And that's, the Lord will lead them through the valley of Achor, or the valley of troubles, into a door of hope. And of course, we know that's Jesus. Mm-hmm. He's our hope. So we were praying as a pastoral team, not knowing, was God calling the church to start that? But it became more and more apparent that he was once again calling me to start another nonprofit. Wow. So 13 years ago, I started working on Door of Hope. Was supposed to be pastoring half-time and Door of Hope half-time, but as you probably know, Jodi, that was 2 full-time jobs.
Oh, yeah. And so you said that Door of Hope has several different facets of ministry. Right. Tell our listeners what Door of Hope does.
Well, from the very beginning, God's vision was so clear, and he gave us a 3-part vision. And the first is to minister to the individual. Something that really sets us apart. Most organizations and even ministries that work with the trauma that comes from abuse and neglect minister to women or women and children. When I had to leave my marriage, God gave me a picture, and I saw his hand on my head and the head of my ex-husband, and I felt his heart for all broken people and broken marriages. And so the first part of the vision is we minister to the individual. We minister to men, to women, to children, and we do that in several different ways. We have support groups. I think everybody can benefit from going through one of those. Currently, our support groups are in 40 states and about 12 countries, and that keeps growing.
And maybe quick talk about which support groups do you have? Do you know off the top of your head?
So our entry-level support group is called Authentic Hope. Again, Authentic Hope being Jesus. And then we have a male counterpart that's called Getting Real.
Oh, wow.
So we do that's our entry-level support groups. And then we do support groups called Living the Emmanuel Lifestyle, and really helping people go deeper in their intimacy with Jesus, how to hear his voice. And they practice in a group and individually. Everybody who comes to Door of Hope, we say we're not about healing, which can be kind of shocking to people, but we're about intimacy.
Okay.
Intimacy with Jesus, because once we can help people get in that intimate place with Jesus, healing becomes a natural overflow of that. So back to the support groups. We also do one called Getting Rest. We do Boundaries, parts 1 and 2. We have parts 1 and 2 of Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You. We do Safe People. And we're in the process of developing more of our own materials as well, and getting a webinar site on our website. So we do that.
That's amazing. That's a lot. That's amazing.
It's a lot. So that's just the first part of how we minister to the individuals. One more support group. About 8 years ago, I started a support group called Trailblazers, and it's for women who have dissociative identity disorder.
Oh, wow.
And again, there's not a lot of places for them to go, and not a lot of if any, support groups for them.
What is that?
So when you go through very harsh trauma, God created our brains where some of those experiences or the emotions around those experiences are buried in the subconscious. We don't know that they're there without God's revelation. And it was God's plan so that little kids don't live with the harsh reality of sexual abuse or the physical abuse or the abandonment that so many go through. So God tucks that away in a secret place until they're ready to deal with that. So Trailblazers has been going now for 8 years. But besides the support groups, we also do a lot of prayer ministry. And my team has been trained in a lot of prayer modalities. But we mainly use something called Emmanuel prayer. It's very gentle. It's so gentle. And it's just helping remove roadblocks so that people can really connect with Jesus in that place. And he can bring truth in the places the enemy has lied to people. We also, we do a lot of prayer ministry. We have several trained prayer ministers. And then we also have 3 trauma-trained therapists on our staff.
Wow.
And all of them know how to bring Jesus into the counseling room, which is kind of unusual, even in the whole counseling world. Mm-hmm. The second part of the vision is we have such a desire to educate the church and organizations. I started this work almost 34 years ago, Jodi.
Wow.
And I've talked to many, many pastors and leaders since that time, and things are changing, thank God.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, I even had pastors say, well, we don't have anybody in our church that's gone through trauma. But the reality is you can go into any building, any event, any church, and you can know there's probably half of the people in that room that are still carrying some unprocessed trauma.
Wow.
So we do conferences and workshops, and we are in the process. We've already recorded a lot of our materials, but we're starting a webinar site on our website, as I just mentioned, so that people can access some of those materials for free, or we'll have a low monthly subscription rate where they can access all of our materials.
It's amazing.
It's so needed, and I'm surprised at how few seminaries and Bible schools actually train leaders on how to deal with trauma.
Yeah.
And the third part of the mission God gave us is we need more safe homes, Jodi. Every time I call the hotline, I can't usually find an open bed in Minnesota.
Wow.
And so we have a possibility right now. We invite all of you out there listening to pray with us. I have 2 women now that I could put into a safe home tomorrow.
Wow.
But we don't have a place yet for them to go. The safe house model that God has given us is this would not just be a safe place for women and children to come, but this would also be a training center. So anyone around the United States or other countries who wanted to start a Door of Hope safe home could come and live there for a month or 2 to be trained on everything that goes in to that. Because there's a lot.
There's a lot.
There's a lot. Yeah.
Wow. So now, speaking of safe homes, you started Dwelling Place. What was the heart behind that when you started the Dwelling Place?
So for those 23 years of marriage, there were times I'd pack the kids up during the night and drive around, but there was no place to go.
Oh, wow.
And just think of it. This is, 40, 50 years ago. No one was really even talking about trauma. And so I would always end up back home. Actually, the average woman leaves home 7 times before she gets out of an abusive situation.
Oh, wow.
It's scary. It takes a lot of courage. And so many women are financially tied. Maybe there's threats. I'm going to take the kids away from you if you try to leave me. So I had no place to go. And so when I finally got out of the marriage under God's direction, I never encourage anybody to be divorced, but I do encourage them to be safe.
Yeah.
So it was never my intention to be divorced. I thought surely he would change. He wouldn't want to lose his wife and his kids, but that did not happen. Shortly after leaving, I started going to Bible school.
Wow.
Which was an amazing experience because in our home we could never talk about Jesus.
So maybe back up and talk a little bit more about your story if you're okay with that.
Sure.
So were you a believer when you got married? Like, what did that look like? How did you come together?
Yeah.
There's so much.
There's so much. But so I grew up in a Lutheran church and I loved Jesus. And we were in church every time the door was open. My parents taught Sunday school. My dad was on the elder board. But there was not much talk about that intimacy with Jesus or the personal relationship with Jesus. And best friends of my parents had a son a little older than I was at the time, and he started becoming very interested in me. And I just kind of assumed we all thought the same thing, although nobody ever talked about it.
Yeah.
I was baptized at 6. I remember it as clear as a bell. Then I was baptized later by immersion, and then I was baptized in the Jordan River when I went to
Oh, goodness. So you've been baptized 3 times. Right. You're like, set.
Yeah. So anyway, I married at 18. He was a little older than me, and he was in the Navy. So before my 19th birthday, I moved to Yokosuka, Japan.
And this was like a family friend you guys knew
Right.
your whole life, so you thought you knew him.
I thought I knew him. When I got to Japan, we lived in a small Japanese community where no one spoke English, or very few. No one I know anyway. And I realized very, very soon that he was extremely controlling in how I wore my hair, what clothes I wore, very verbally abusive, and a whole lot of sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. He got involved in Eastern religions over there, and being so far from home, and just think how many years ago this was. I remember it cost $17 for a 3-minute call to the United States. No cell phones back then. And we were making $198 a month.
So you were really cut off from family.
I was cut off from everybody.
Yeah.
My personality is one that thinks I can always fix things. And I always had faith that somehow he would get it, he would change. But when we left Japan, I came back to the United States and he was sent to Vietnam. He came home even more broken.
Oh, wow.
Shortly after he got home, he had continued to be very enmeshed in Eastern religions, but he met a man from India and started to be groomed by him and eventually converted to Hinduism. I don't know what you know about the religion, but it is very sexually abusive. Anyway, he didn't work a lot during those years, and there was many years I worked 2 full-time jobs, being my type A personality, doing whatever I could to keep the family afloat.
Do you have kids at this point yet?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we have 2 daughters and a son. So I finally, let me back up a little bit. I finally, let me start with Bible school. While I was in Bible school, I started doing a lot of prison ministry, and I loved it because I felt like a prisoner during those years. I felt like there was no place to go. But once I'm kind of vacillating between 2 stories here, so bear with me. But once I'll finish this and then I'll go back to the marriage. But once I graduated from Bible school, I was hired by Christian Recovery Center. I did all their PR development work, and I started leading support groups there. But every week we had women coming who are like, my kids and I are in danger. We need to get out. But we want a place where Jesus is the center of the healing. So I'm a pretty good researcher. I thought I'll just start researching. And I could not find a Spirit-filled, Christ-centered, safe home for women and kids fleeing domestic violence anywhere in Minnesota, nowhere in the 5-state area, nowhere in the United States. Mm-hmm. So God kept tugging at my heart, and I was kind of upset. I'm like, this is an epidemic, and nobody in the body of Christ is doing this. Well, you probably know from experience, Jodi, those are kind of some dangerous questions.
Oh, yeah.
So
it's the birthplace of vision.
Pretty soon God said, you do it. And I'm like, no, that's not what I meant, But when you know it's him, at least for me, the answer has to be yes. And so in 1997, I started pulling together documents on how to start a nonprofit. I knew nothing. I was inept, unqualified, but Jesus didn't care. He just wanted the yes in my heart. So back to the marriage. So when he came home from Vietnam, even more broken, those years were rugged. He didn't work a lot. I put him through college. He still didn't want to work. And I continued to overwork. If I knew today, or if I knew then what I know today, I would have gone on a sit-down strike, but I was in survival mode. Our first daughter was born right when I came home from Japan, and 3 years later we had another girl, and then 7 years later, a son. There was a time during those years when he was so heavily involved with this so-called guru from India that I just kind of checked out. I was not able to be there emotionally for my kids. Fortunately, because of Jesus, we've all healed. There's some of my best friends today. But many years fast forward later, the abuse continued. I continued to overwork. there came a time where I really got enough courage, and it was when I was pregnant with my son, that I said, no, it stops here. It stops now. And so I got enough courage to say that man from India would never be in our home again. And I started sneaking out to Bible studies. And the very first Bible study I went to was How to Live in the Power of the Holy Spirit.
That's providential.
About God, about God. Things progressed. I got involved with a women's group, a Bible study group, and they were so supportive. And one of these dear women, her name is Ruth Singh. I probably know her. Her son is Paul Singh, who's no longer with us, but she took the kids and I into hiding. I left him a note saying, if you ever want to see us again, you'll meet here with me, with this pastor. And he did, and he played the game well. He went to counseling with me, and we met with the pastor, and he put on a good front. But all of a sudden, he accepted a job out on the West Coast, and he moved us. And so here we were isolated again. During that time, especially my girls were going through some really hard things. And one of my daughters was hospitalized because of a suicide attempt, and he would not even go see her. So when she got out, I sent her back to Minnesota, and I made a plan to get out. It was scary.
Wow, that's something.
But I drove every back road from Seattle back to Minnesota, and God was a miracle worker. We still had a home here, and the day before I got back, the renters just up and moved out without notice. This group of women that I was in the Bible study with, and some of my family, brought furniture and food, and then I called my old boss, and he was so excited. I got my job back. Because
God was before you. He was going before you.
It was miracle after miracle, Jodi. Miracle after miracle. Yeah.
And then what happened when he realized you guys were gone? Anything?
Within 4 days after we left, first of all, he cleaned out our bank accounts. He closed our credit cards, so I ended up back in Minnesota with $1 in my pocket. I thought for sure he'd be parked at our doorstep, just wanting to do anything to make things right. But 4 days after I left, he had another woman living in my house with him, which wasn't a surprise.
That wasn't a surprise to you? No.
That was not that wasn't a surprise because of other behaviors of unfaithfulness. It still hurt deeply. And our oldest daughter was getting married 3 months after I left. So he came back for the wedding. And I approached him and asked if he was willing to put in the work to try again. And he said he was done with me, and he was moving on with this other woman. But he ended up losing custody of the kids. And so they have not seen him for 32 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm sorry. What a tragic story, but God somehow takes all of it and he turns it. And so it's given you a lot of compassion and a lot of insight for what other people are going through. And I know when people come into the church, like we often as pastors can be trained on what to look for in abuse, like in kids, we're mandatory reporters. We have to know that kind of stuff, but we don't always see the hidden things that people are coming in with some of this trauma and abuse. And so that's some of the area that you are an expert in. And so how did all that fold into the ministry that you do today?
Well, if I could share one quick story first. So during the years of Bible school, I was trying to get a mentor for my son. He was just 9 when we left, and God didn't bring, he brought 2 young men, but not till my son was 12. And so I said to him, I said, I am so sorry that I couldn't find somebody before this for you. And he said, Mom, are you kidding me? I would have never gotten to know Father God as my father if there was another human being in the picture. He's a faithful, godly man. But back to your question, because there were not a lot of people talking about trauma or doing work in trauma, it was really hard. But I found a little 2-line ad in a shopping guide that said Christian Support Group for Battered Women. So I called, and it was at New Life Family Services. And I joined the support group, and I met a beautiful woman named Janet Nelson. And she loved me to wholeness. We didn't know what we were doing, but we kept praying, God, give us the next step, give us the next step, give us the next step. And he was so faithful, and he spoke to us. And out of my experiences, I've written a book to help people start that process, to share the tools that God used in my life so that they could find the same kind of freedom that I have found, because God's not a respecter of persons. And so I wrote that first book probably, 22 years ago. We just did a revised update on it. But God just kept leading me to the right places, to the right people. And I was introduced to a couple, actually 3 Christian therapists who were doing a lot of kind of pioneer frontier work in healing from trauma and how trauma affects the brain. And so I started studying under them, and studied under Paul Cox on generational trauma. And I'm a learner. I love to learn. And
you're a learner and entrepreneur. So kind of backing up to marriage, how as like ministers, when we're looking at people, you can hear, I hear it often where people are just like, just trust God. God's going to put this marriage back together, and just kind of some encouragement to stay. How do people know when it's an abusive marriage versus maybe just a bad marriage, or things that they need to work on?
Right. The first thing is just listen and believe them. It takes a lot of courage. And if they're sharing something, realize it's probably just the tip of the iceberg. I am not for marriage counseling when there's any form of abuse going on.
And maybe talk about a little bit, what would you categorize as abuse?
Oh, my
Just
goodness.
In general, next week we'll talk, or not next week, on the next episode we'll dig into more specifics.
Right. So anything that inflicts injury on our God-given identity.
Yep.
And so often people look at trauma as being hit or sexually abused. And I think historically, people talk about trauma in those terms. We call that trauma B. That's the bad things that happen. But trauma A is the absence of all the good things that you should get, to be treasured, to be valued, to be listened to be supported, to be encouraged. And trauma A can actually have a much worse effect on someone than trauma B. Trauma B, you have a memory or an incident to go back to. The day he hit me, the time I was raped. And we help people bring Jesus' perspective into those places. But the trauma A is like this big dark hole. There's no memory to go back to. It just kind of invades your whole being. We have an epidemic of trauma A in the church. People going around thinking, why do I feel so bad? Nothing bad ever happened to me. And yet there's this lack of all the goodness that should be there. And I believe in a marriage, we can go back to the Hebrew, like Ezer Kenegdo, but we won't go that deep today. But I believe it's equal value, equal responsibility, equal voice. And so somebody who's psychologically abused, verbally abused, put down, questioned, all of those things on a continual, constant basis, it just chips away at your identity. You lose your voice. And so if somebody's coming to you to share even a little bit, know that you're probably just seeing a fraction of what's actually going on in the marriage. And a bad marriage or a conflicted marriage, both people are willing to own, I have a part in this. I need to work on this area in my life. I'm getting triggered because of these things in my past. And when both people in the marriage are willing to work on that, divorce care calls it the line of reconciliation. And if both people come to that line and they own their behavior, they're willing to repent, they're willing to change with God's help, then that marriage has great, great potential to be restored. But if one person is making it about the other person, they have a long way to go. A long way to go.
Yeah, I went to what was the Hope Conference?
The Hope Builders Conference.
Hope Builders Conference. I always have to have you remind me of what that was. But one of the things that stood out to me was where there's control. Right. So there's controlling. If there's controlling, there is likely abuse. And yes. I liked how you had said earlier how guys, I don't like that anybody's abused, but you mentioned that guys are experiencing abuse. And I think we can miss that too. There are women who are being battered and abused in marriages, but guys can also be abused.
Yeah, and so many men. If a woman is hitting or throwing objects and they have to go to the emergency room, they're usually kind of poo-pooed. You're a big guy, this little bitty gal, how can she hurt you? And so they're often not believed. It takes a lot of courage for a woman to come forth and talk about these things, but for a man to come forth, man, I give him a lot of credit. Mm-hmm. One of our last men's group, we had a male leader that had to step out, and so I led with another male leader. These men didn't care I was a woman. I'm just kind of a safe great-grandma. But 3 of the men in there, their wives were the abusive ones. Mm. 2 of the men in there had been sexually abused as little boys and had never, ever told anybody. Mm. So there's a lot of hope for marriages when both people are willing and own their own stuff. But if one person is making it all about the other person, kind of takes a wake-up call. Mm-hmm. Statistics bear it out that the success rate isn't very high. But we've seen marriages be restored. We've seen men and women be healed and come back together in a really safe place. One comment I want to make on control is whenever you see control happening, know that underneath that is fear and insecurity. Hmm. And anyone using control, things are so out of control inside. There's a false belief that if I can get this all under control, I will feel better. And control looks different. And in my marriage, I got very controlling. But it wasn't control to necessarily hurt people or put people down. It was the kind of control where I was hyper-vigilant. I was always making sure nobody was going to get hurt, and what should I say, and how should I say it, and when should I say it? Even lying to the kids. Well, he didn't mean that. He's had a bad day. He really loves you. And so my control looked a lot different, but it was still control. Yeah. It was still not releasing to Jesus and asking him to heal me, because there was reasons I was doing that behavior. one of the things we see so often when people come to us is they're externally or internally asking the question, what's wrong with me? We try to help them change that to what happened to me. What happened to me? And I tell women and the men I minister to, you didn't wake up one morning and decide to be afraid or to be filled with anxiety or to be controlling. What happened to bring that behavior in? And so when we go back to some of those origins with Jesus and he brings truth into those places, you can just see light bulbs come on in people. Jodi, I believe that the enemy has two main agendas. The first is to get us to believe God isn't who he said he is. The second is to get us to believe that we are not who God says we are. And when people have wrong impressions of God, it's because something happened to them. We believe that our number one job, our number one role when people come to us is to help them feel safe. Because if they don't feel safe, they're not going to let our love or the love of Jesus come into their heart. There'll be a wall.
Oh, that's so powerful. And even thinking about that in the church, how the church needs to be a safe place for people to come and experience Jesus. How does all of this play into how we should minister in the church, or people, whether they're pastors or Team Emmanuel leaders, parishioners, how we can interact with people knowing that there's abuse?
Right. So as I started to say, first of all, believe them and just listen. And I often tell people, you don't have to trust me. You don't have to trust me. You don't know me. It's up to me to show you I'm trustworthy. And so to hear their heart and meet them where they're at, to attune to them. My favorite definition of attunement is we help people feel felt. That we help people feel felt.
It's a great definition.
And you mentioned, people maybe saying, well, just have faith or just trust God, or maybe you give them a scripture. All those things are true, but in these cases, they're not helpful. And I remember somebody giving me a book. This is a confession time for Diane, but somebody gave me a book, How to Pray Your Husband into the Kingdom.
They're trying to be nice and helpful to you.
Right.
Yeah.
I went outside and threw that book in the garbage. It's a good book, but I wasn't at that place. Yep. I just needed somebody to hold me and tell me it's going to be okay. I believe you. How can I support you in this? And let them go at their own pace. But any platitudes or simple answers, they know they're not trusting God like they want to. They know that their impressions of who God is and how God sees them are probably not correct. But there's a lot of groundwork that needs to take place first. And I always encourage pastors and leaders, just be with them. I mean, if you just pray blessings over them and then refer them to a place like Door of Hope that has significant training on how to work with trauma. And again, we're always up to come in and do more training with pastors and leaders.
And again, resources you have, the different groups, you have some online groups. You said you're in different states. How does that look? Is that online, or you have groups trained?
Yeah, we have quite a few trained support group leaders, and we've just launched every support group leader now has to go through a certification program, because we want to be sure, first of all, they're healed to a place where they're not getting triggered, but that they don't water down the material, that what they're giving is in sync with Door of Hope. So we do a lot of support groups in person. We do some at churches. We're actually doing 3 of them here starting next Monday.
And they're all full, aren't they?
They're all full.
That's awesome.
We have 18 women and 12 men that signed up. But we do a lot of online also. And then we do some hybrid where some people are in the office and some are on Zoom. But we are able to minister all over the country, all over the world, and country because of Zoom. So we do a lot of Zoom groups as well.
Wow. So amazing. I think we'll dive deeper in the next episode on what is abuse. I think that when I was at the Hope Conference, I always keep saying it with Hope
Builders.
Hope Builders. Okay, I'll get that built to me. Hope Builders Conference, that was the thing that really stood out to me, is just the different kinds of abuse.
Yes.
Like we think of the 2 big ones, but like you said, there's other ones as well. So as we're wrapping up here, how can shepherd-hearted leaders become more equipped to care for those around us who have suffered trauma or abuse?
Be a learner. Come see us, give us a call, check out our website, check out our support groups. But we're not the only ones. There's a lot of great organizations now training on trauma. We do a lot of training on Emmanuel prayer. Just don't go beyond your scope of experience, I guess. If your church would like us to come and do a training, reach out to me. And we'd be happy to connect and do that for you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you for your time today.
Oh, this has been great. Thanks, Jodi.
Great having you. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Shepherd-Hearted Leader podcast. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. Please share this episode and subscribe. Leave a comment, and we will leave all the resources for Door of Hope in the description. And be sure to listen to the next episode. We're going to go deeper into abuse and what it actually looks like. You know, we hear a lot of podcasts, or I've heard quite a few on pastoral leaders who have had abuse, but we don't always hear about the parishioners having abuse in their lives and how to minister to them. So I'm so excited to have this mini series with you. Until next time, keep leading well.